What if the moment you stop reacting is the exact moment everything starts to change? Not louder arguments, not longer explanations, not proving your worth, but silence, calm, and emotional distance. Strange, right? Yet this is where real power begins. Narcissists thrive on reactions. Every tear, every angry message, every attempt to be understood feeds their control. But what happens when you suddenly stop giving them what they crave? When your emotions are no longer available for manipulation? That shift is not just noticeable, it's destabilizing. And the most fascinating part, they can feel it before you say a word. You'll start to see behavior changes, confusion, and even desperation on their side. In this video, we're uncovering the psychological truth behind why non-reaction is so powerful, what Carl Jung's ideas reveal about this dynamic, and the subtle signs that show you're finally taking your power back. Stay until the end, because the final insight might completely change how you handle difficult people forever. And if this speaks to you, don't just watch silently, join the conversation. Drop your experience in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next shift in perspective. Narcissists crave reaction the way fire craves oxygen, because your emotional energy is the very thing that keeps their sense of control alive. And once you understand this dynamic, everything begins to look different. Every time you feel pulled into an argument, every time you explain yourself for the 10th time, every time you feel guilty for emotions that are not even yours to carry, something subtle but powerful is happening beneath the surface. They are measuring their influence over you. Anger tells them they can still provoke you. Tears tell them they can still hurt you. Long explanations tell them you are still trying to win their approval. And even silence filled with tension tells them they still occupy space in your mind. This is why reactions are so valuable to them. They are proof of relevance. From a psychological perspective, this behavior often connects to what Carl Jung described as the shadow self, the hidden parts of the personality that a person refuses to face within themselves. Instead of confronting their own insecurity, shame, or fear of inadequacy, narcissists project these feelings outward, placing them onto others. They may accuse you of being selfish when they are the ones acting that way, or call you too sensitive when they are avoiding their own emotional wounds. The painful part is that when you react, when you defend yourself, when you become emotional, you unknowingly confirm their inner narrative. Your response becomes evidence in their mind that the problem is not within them, but within you. Over time, this can trap you in a loop where you are constantly trying to prove your goodness, your loyalty, your intelligence, or your worth, while they continue shifting the goalposts. It becomes exhausting, confusing, and deeply destabilizing, because no matter how carefully you choose your words, the outcome rarely changes. That is because the goal was never understanding. The goal was control. Once you recognize this, you begin to see why silence can be so powerful. Silence does not mean you agree with them. It does not mean you are weak. It means you are no longer offering your emotional energy as a resource for manipulation. When you stop reacting, you interrupt the pattern they rely on. They expect you to get upset, to argue back, to explain yourself, to feel guilty. When that reaction does not come, something shifts. The dynamic changes because suddenly they are left alone with their own emotions, their own insecurity, and their own lack of control. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to being emotionally responsive or empathetic, but emotional regulation is not the same as emotional shutdown. It is a conscious choice to protect your inner peace. The more you practice this, the clearer it becomes that many conflicts were never about communication at all, but about power. You start to notice how often your reactions were being used against you, how your kindness was being twisted, how your empathy was being exploited. And with that awareness comes a quiet strength. You begin to respond instead of react. You pause instead of explode. You observe instead of engage. This shift is not about punishing the other person. It is about reclaiming yourself. When you no longer feel the urge to defend every accusation, explain every misunderstanding, or chase every moment of approval, you step out of the emotional trap. You start to realize that your worth was never something you needed to prove in the first place. Understanding the psychology behind this process can be deeply freeing because it turns confusion into clarity. You are no longer asking, "Why do they treat me like this?" but instead seeing the pattern for what it is: a person avoiding their own inner work by trying to control the outer world. And once you see that clearly, their behavior loses much of its emotional charge. You stop internalizing their projections. You stop carrying their unresolved wounds. You stop feeling responsible for fixing what was never yours to fix. That is the moment silence becomes strength, detachment becomes protection, and emotional control becomes personal power. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood, but it is one of the most powerful shifts a person can make when dealing with manipulation, because the moment you stop reacting emotionally, the entire dynamic begins to change in ways you can actually feel. For a long time, the control may have seemed invisible, woven into everyday conversations, small comments, subtle guilt trips, or emotional pressure that slowly trained you to respond in predictable ways. You may have found yourself getting upset when they criticized you, over-explaining when they misunderstood you, feeling anxious when they pulled away, or trying harder when they gave you less. These reactions did not make you weak, they made you human. But for someone who relies on control, those emotional patterns become a roadmap. They learn exactly which buttons to press, when to pull back, when to provoke, and when to reward you just enough to keep you emotionally engaged. Emotional detachment changes this completely, because instead of being driven by emotional impulses, you begin responding with awareness. You pause, you breathe, you choose whether a conversation deserves your energy instead of automatically giving it. This is where the power starts to shift. You are no longer reacting from pain, fear, or the need to be understood. You are acting from clarity, and that shift is deeply unsettling for someone who thrives on emotional chaos. Emotional detachment does not mean you become cold, distant, or uncaring. It does not mean you stop feeling. It simply means you stop allowing someone else's behavior to control your emotional state. You still care, but you care with boundaries. You still listen, but you no longer absorb every emotional weight placed on you. You still speak, but you speak without the need to convince or defend yourself endlessly. There is a quiet confidence that begins to form when you realize you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. Narcissists depend on emotional predictability. They expect the same cycle. They provoke, you react, they withdraw, you chase, they criticize, you defend, they confuse, you overthink. When that cycle breaks, when you respond with calm instead of emotion, with silence instead of argument, with indifference instead of desperation, they lose their sense of control. Confusion begins to replace certainty. They may push harder at first, testing whether your calm is real. They may change tactics, using guilt, charm, anger, or even sudden kindness, all in an attempt to pull you back into the familiar pattern. But when your emotional state remains steady, when your energy no longer rises and falls based on their behavior, something profound happens. The emotional leverage they once had over you begins to dissolve. Your calm becomes powerful, not because it is dramatic, but because it is unmovable. It sends a message without words: you are no longer in charge of my inner world. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to being deeply empathetic or emotionally responsive. You might worry that you are being selfish, or that you are becoming too distant, or that you are somehow doing something wrong. But emotional detachment is not cruelty. It is self-respect. It is the recognition that your emotional energy is valuable and deserves protection. Over time, this shift brings clarity. You begin to see conversations more objectively. You notice manipulation faster. You stop getting pulled into circular arguments that lead nowhere. You start choosing peace over proving your point. And in that space of calm awareness, You begin to feel something that may have been missing for a long time: emotional freedom. You are no longer controlled by their moods, their approval, their silence, or their anger. You become steady, grounded, and self-directed. This is why emotional detachment feels so threatening to someone who depends on control. They can no longer read you as easily. They can no longer predict your reactions. They can no longer use your emotions as tools. And while they may not admit it openly, they feel the shift. The balance of power changes quietly but clearly. You stop living in reaction mode, and you start living with intention. And once that shift happens, there is no going back to the old dynamic, because you have seen what it feels like to be emotionally in control of yourself. When a narcissist's usual tactics stop working, something deeply uncomfortable begins to happen beneath the surface, and that discomfort often reveals more truth than any argument ever could. For someone who has built their identity around control, admiration, and emotional influence over others, manipulation is not just a habit, it is a coping mechanism that protects a fragile inner world. As long as their behavior produces the reactions they expect, their sense of self feels stable. They feel powerful, validated, and in charge of the emotional environment around them. But when you stop reacting, when you no longer argue back, chase their approval, or emotionally engage with their provocations, the foundation they rely on begins to weaken. This is where what psychologists describe as a narcissistic injury can occur, a moment when their inflated self-image collides with reality and starts to crack. They are forced to face a painful contradiction: they are no longer in control of you. That realization can feel threatening, even unbearable, for someone who depends on control to feel safe. What often follows is not reflection or accountability, but escalation. They may try guilt-tripping, reminding you of everything they have done for you, twisting the past to make you feel ungrateful or selfish. They may suddenly shift into love bombing, overwhelming you with attention, affection, or praise, not out of genuine emotional growth, but as a strategy to pull you back into the emotional dynamic they are losing. They might use the silent treatment, withdrawing communication to trigger anxiety, hoping your discomfort will push you to reconnect and restore their sense of power. On the surface, these behaviors can look different, but they all come from the same place: fear of losing control. The important thing to understand is that these escalations are not signs of strength, they are signs of instability. They reveal that the old methods are no longer effective, and that terrifies someone who depends on predictability in others to maintain emotional dominance. Your non-reaction becomes a mirror they cannot avoid. It reflects back the insecurity they have spent so much time trying to hide, the emptiness behind the grand image, the vulnerability beneath the arrogance. When you do not respond to their provocations, they are left alone with feelings they have long avoided: inadequacy, rejection, shame, and fear of being unimportant. That internal confrontation can be overwhelming, which is why many narcissists double down on manipulation instead of looking inward. But the shift has already begun. You are no longer playing the role they assigned you. You are no longer the emotional supply they relied on. You are no longer validating their narrative through your reactions. This can be confusing to witness, especially if you care about the person, because you might see them become more dramatic, more emotional, or more unpredictable than before. But this behavior is not proof that you are doing something wrong. It is often proof that you are finally doing something right. Your calm disrupts their emotional script. Your boundaries challenge their expectations. Your silence removes the stage they once performed on. Over time, you begin to see that many of their reactions are driven by desperation rather than confidence. The person who once seemed so in control now appears unsettled, reactive, and uncertain. And in that contrast, your own growth becomes more visible. You are no longer trying to fix them. You are no longer trying to manage their emotions. You are no longer bending yourself into shapes that keep them comfortable. Instead, you are standing still in your own emotional space, observing rather than absorbing, responding rather than reacting. This shift is not about punishing the other person. It is about protecting yourself. It is about choosing clarity over confusion, peace over chaos, self-respect over emotional exhaustion. When their tactics stop working, the truth of the dynamic becomes clear. Their power was never real. It was borrowed from your emotional investment. And the moment you stop giving that investment, their sense of control begins to unravel. What remains is not your responsibility to fix, but their own inner work to face, whether they choose to do so or not. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but in truth, it is one of the strongest emotional positions you can hold, especially when you are dealing with manipulation, conflict, or constant misunderstanding. Most people grow up believing that being heard requires constant explanation, that defending yourself is a duty, and that clarity will come if you just find the right words. But when you are interacting with someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, no amount of explanation will ever be enough. Every word becomes another opportunity for your intentions to be twisted, your emotions to be used against you, and your energy to be drained. This is where the real power of silence begins to emerge. Silence is not passive. It is a conscious choice to step out of emotional conflict and refuse to participate in conversations that go nowhere. You begin to understand that you do not owe a response to every provocation, a defense to every accusation, or an explanation to every person who demands access to your inner world. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to being the one who tries to fix things, smooth things over, or keep the peace. But over time, you begin to notice something surprising. The less you explain, the clearer your boundaries become. The less you argue, the stronger your presence feels. Silence creates emotional distance, and emotional distance creates clarity. When you stop reacting verbally to every comment or criticism, you start observing patterns instead of getting caught inside them. You see how often the same arguments repeat. You notice how often your words are ignored or reshaped to fit someone else's narrative. And in that awareness, you begin to understand that your dignity does not come from convincing others of your truth, but from staying grounded in it. Silence becomes a way of saying, without saying anything, that your peace matters more than winning an argument. It becomes a way of protecting your emotional energy from being constantly pulled into unnecessary battles. For someone who relies on emotional engagement to feel in control, your silence can be deeply unsettling. They may try harder to provoke a response, raise their voice, use sharper words, or revisit old conflicts just to pull you back into the familiar cycle. But each time you remain calm, each time you choose not to engage, you reinforce a powerful boundary. You are no longer available for emotional manipulation. Your calm begins to speak louder than any explanation ever could. It communicates self-respect. It communicates emotional maturity. It communicates that you are aware of the dynamic and that you refuse to play along. Over time, you may notice that your inner world begins to feel more peaceful. You are no longer replaying arguments in your head. You are no longer searching for the perfect response hours later. You are no longer carrying the emotional weight of conversations that never led to understanding. Instead, you begin to feel more grounded, more centered, and more in control of your own emotional space. This is the quiet power of silence. It allows you to choose when to speak and when to step back. It allows you to conserve your energy for relationships and conversations that are healthy, mutual, and respectful. It helps you realize that you do not need to attend every conflict you are invited to. Some arguments are not meant to be won, they are meant to be walked away from. And walking away is not giving up, it is choosing yourself. When you stop arguing with someone who refuses to hear you, you are not losing your voice, you are honoring it. You are acknowledging that your words are valuable and deserve to be spoken in spaces where they are respected. Silence in this way becomes an act of self-trust. It is you saying, "I know who I am, even if you choose not to. It is you saying, I will not hand you my emotions for you to misuse. It is you saying, you no longer have unlimited access to me. This shift may not always be visible on the outside, but internally it is profound. You begin to feel less reactive and more intentional. You begin to feel less controlled and more free. You begin to understand that the strongest people in the room are often the quietest, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know when silence speaks louder than words. Healing from narcissistic manipulation is not just about survival, it is about reclaiming your life, your energy, and your sense of self, and it begins the moment you stop reacting. For a long time, reacting may have felt like the only way to survive, like the only way to assert yourself or to protect your boundaries, because engaging seemed unavoidable. Every insult, every manipulation, every subtle jab may have pulled you into defensive loops that drained your energy and kept you living on someone else's terms. But the moment you consciously decide to pause, to stop feeding the cycle of provocation and response, a powerful shift begins. You are no longer a participant in someone else's drama, you are becoming the observer of your own life. This is not passivity, it is active, deliberate self-mastery. By choosing when to respond and when to remain detached, you redirect energy that was previously consumed by anxiety, frustration, or guilt toward growth, clarity, and emotional regulation. You begin to recognize patterns in behavior, both yours and theirs, without feeling compelled to react to them immediately. This is where Carl Jung's concept of individuation becomes profoundly relevant. Individuation is the process of becoming your authentic self, of separating who you truly are from the roles, expectations, and projections imposed by others. When you stop reacting to a narcissist, you stop living according to their narrative and begin living according to your own values and principles. You start noticing who you are beneath the layers of obligation, guilt, and emotional manipulation, and you begin to nurture the parts of yourself that may have been neglected or suppressed. The energy you once invested in defending, explaining, or appeasing is now available to strengthen your emotional intelligence, to set and maintain boundaries, and to understand your own needs without shame or hesitation. This shift is not sudden, it is a gradual, deliberate process. At first, it may feel awkward to disengage from habitual patterns, because your mind is so used to reacting. You may even feel guilt or doubt, wondering if you are being cold or unfair. But over time, as you practice this emotional discipline, you notice an increasing sense of stability. You feel grounded not because the external situation has changed, but because your internal state is no longer dependent on it. Your self-worth is no longer tethered to someone else's perception, approval, or manipulations. This is the essence of moving from survival to self-mastery. You are no longer just protecting yourself from harm, you are actively cultivating your own growth, insight, and resilience. Your decisions begin to align more with your authentic self rather than reacting to the whims of someone else. You may begin to reclaim parts of your life that were previously sacrificed, your passions, your creative energy, your relationships with others who respect and support you. In this state of self-mastery, clarity replaces confusion. You understand why certain interactions used to drain you and why others now feel manageable. You notice that emotional regulation is not about suppressing feelings, but about observing them, understanding their source, and choosing how to act with intention. You feel more in control not because you dominate others, but because you have regained ownership of your own inner world. This journey from reaction to mastery also brings profound healing. By stepping out of the cycle of provocation and response, you allow yourself to process experiences without being trapped in the emotional turbulence created by manipulation. You begin to forgive yourself for past overreactions, to recognize your resilience, and to honor the progress you are making. Each moment of calm, each intentional pause, each choice to act from clarity rather than instinct reinforces a sense of inner authority that no one else can take away. Ultimately, this is a transformative process. It moves you from a state of survival, where your energy is constantly borrowed by the needs and manipulations of others, to a state of self-mastery, where your energy, focus, and emotional power are fully reclaimed. It is here that you realize the true freedom that comes from knowing yourself deeply, aligning with your authentic self, and no longer allowing anyone else's behavior to dictate your inner state. The healing that begins with stopping reactions is not just about protecting yourself, it is about evolving into a stronger, wiser, and more self-aware version of yourself, fully capable of living life on your own terms. The ultimate transformation in dealing with narcissistic influence is not about changing them, proving a point, or regaining control over someone else. It is about reclaiming yourself. For so long, you may have felt trapped in a cycle where their moods, manipulations, and reactions dictated your own emotional state, leaving you exhausted, anxious, and constantly vigilant. You monitored their behavior, walked on eggshells to avoid conflict, explained your intentions repeatedly, and measured every word for fear of triggering anger, guilt, or disapproval. In doing so, your energy, focus, and emotional freedom were steadily siphoned away, leaving you reactive rather than intentional. But the moment you stop reacting and stop offering your attention as a source of power, something profound occurs. Their influence begins to fade. The control they once held over you was never inherent. It was borrowed from your engagement, your emotional investment, and your need for validation. When you no longer provide these, their ability to manipulate diminishes almost automatically. This shift is deeply liberating because it is internal, not dependent on external circumstances. You no longer need to track their moods, anticipate their reactions, or manage the chaos they create. You stop trying to earn their approval or defend your worth, and in that space a remarkable clarity emerges. Freed from the constant drain of emotional vigilance, you begin to notice how much energy had been consumed by someone else's story rather than your own life. You start redirecting that energy toward yourself, toward your goals, your passions, your growth, and your peace. With every step away from reaction, your sovereignty expands. You are no longer a participant in their narrative, you are fully inhabiting your own. This is the real victory, and it is unlike anything that can be achieved through argument, confrontation, or manipulation. It is not about dominating them, it is about standing firmly in your own emotional space, untouchable by attempts to provoke or control. This freedom is often accompanied by a sense of lightness and relief that can feel almost foreign at first. You may notice that old anxieties fade, that your need to explain or justify yourself diminishes, and that your attention is no longer constantly fragmented by someone else's drama. Your mind becomes clearer because it is no longer clouded by anticipation of manipulation or by the habitual looping of old conflicts. In this space, you start to recognize the patterns of your own responses, the ones that previously gave them power, and you are able to observe them without judgment. Each moment of non-reaction becomes a reinforcement of your inner strength and self-mastery. Over time, this shift has a compounding effect. The less you react, the less their strategies work. The more you focus on yourself, the more resilient and confident you become. Their attempts at control, whether subtle guilt, anger, or even charm, begin to lose significance because your inner equilibrium is no longer dependent on their behavior. This is not only emotionally freeing, but also transformative for your relationships and sense of identity. You learn to define yourself by your own values, principles, and goals, rather than by someone else's manipulations. You are no longer seeking external validation, you are validating yourself internally, and that self-validation cannot be taken away. This ultimate shift also has practical implications. You start choosing your interactions more deliberately, investing in people and situations that honor your energy and withdrawing from those that exploit it. You begin to make decisions without fear of provoking them or needing to justify your actions. You reclaim time and mental space that was once spent worrying about someone else's moods or reactions. In essence, the final transformation is about sovereignty over your own life. When a narcissist loses power, it is not a dramatic confrontation that creates freedom, it is your consistent non-reaction, your refusal to participate in their control, and your commitment to your own emotional well-being. Your freedom is not dependent on them changing. It exists the moment you reclaim your attention, your energy, and your inner peace. And that is the true measure of victory, not power over another, but mastery over yourself, unshakable and independent, allowing you to live fully in a space that is yours alone.